Welcome. Can everybody hear me without a mic? I think I'm usually pretty good without one. Not all of our staff are, but first of all, thank you for coming. We're glad that you're here today. We have a packed agenda, but we'll move through it real quick and probably be done somewhere around 11:15, 11:20, and then lunch will be brought in. But what we want to do today is have a real informal conversation on water issues, our rates. This is really the meeting annually where we talk about long-term projections for our rates and what those look like. So David Thompson, our CFO, will do that. Tiffany Morgan is going to introduce to you a little bit something that you may not be aware of, how extensive some of the environmental monitoring that we do. So I've asked her to walk you through some of that. Really so that if you need environmental data or water quality issues, you'll know where to begin to look for what we're doing, or if you have environmental concerns with water quality, really to introduce you to the process so you can start working through us to help us prioritize what we do in the future as far as environmental monitoring goes. Aaron Abel is going to tell you a little bit about how much space we don't have for storage. Translated another way, we don't need another drop of water. Unfortunately, more water's coming, and there's going to be a lot of, for you lower basin customers, there's going to be a lot of water in the river for a long time. So there's a couple of different ways to look at that. One is there's a lot of water coming, and the other is it's summer and there's going to be some water. So that's a good thing also. And then Matt Phillip will tell you a little bit about, I'll let him talk about Allen's Creek. As you know, we've had a huge legislative session as far as the VRA is concerned. A lot of you were very instrumental in helping that process achieve success. And it is our objective to send an agreement to the city of Houston to move that legislation forward this Friday. So we are moving post haste with Allen's Creek. But Matt will talk a little bit more about that. He's going to come and give you an update on water legislation in the session that we just escaped from. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm David Collinsworth. I'm the GM CEO of VRA. I've been in that role for a little over a year. I've been with VRA now for 25 years. Next week is my 25th year anniversary. So I've been around the water business a long time. I know most of you. It's good to be here. We've got a lot of things that are moving forward. We've got some real aggressive initiatives to develop more water in the next 10 to 15 years that are going to start impacting our rates in the next 5 to 10 years, not including Allen's Creek. So those are things that we want to make sure that you're included in. So here's my offer to you today. When you talk about budgets, for those of you that aren't CPAs, and I'm not, and those of you that these type of numbers and these type of discussions really aren't fun to sit through, if you want our staff to come sit with you and go through what our budgets look like and our long-term planning for our projects, we'd be more than willing to do that. We've moved this meeting we have in July, but we wanted to have this meeting earlier. Hopefully next year it will even be a little bit earlier in the year. The legislative session pushed us back a little bit because of we got overwhelmed with the Allen's Creek bill. But really, we wanted time to present our draft budget to you, show you those numbers, and then be able to work through challenges before we present it to our board in late July. So that's really the purpose of moving this meeting up. So anyway, with no further ado, Aaron, why don't you come up and talk water supply, and then we'll work through our program. Thank y'all.
Morning. I think this mic will work just fine. So on the water supply standpoint, we wanted to do a couple things today. One is to kind of walk you past this past year, past 12 months. You know, we've had a range of hydrologic conditions over the last 12 months. So we've seen some drought, and then obviously right now we're seeing some significant flooding and high river levels. So we'll walk through a couple slides to that respect, and then also we wanted to update you on new long-term contracts under the system operation permit and the steps going forward on that. So we'll have a little bit of discussion about that. So we'll go ahead and get started here. This is a series of graphics that we've shown probably the last, 4 or 5 years at customer meetings, and most everybody knows what the drought monitor is. And it's basically tells you how wet or dry it is, and the drought intensity legend down here indicates the yellow is abnormally dry all the way to exceptional drought in the reddish brown. So the drought monitor comes out every week. It's put together by various universities, the National Drought Mitigation Center, NOAA, USDA, a number of different factors and entities. Takes into consideration stream flow, soil moisture, impacts to agriculture and reservoir storage. So it's a qualitative factor there. We also have our reservoir storage, our reservoir percent full. Each one of these dots represents the location of our reservoirs in our water supply system, and then the corresponding percent full. So this map here is as of about a week or two ago, late May of this year, and you can see that most of the state and all of the Brazos River Basin is completely drought-free, and that's something we haven't seen probably since about 2016 or so, 2016, 2015, at the end of the most recent drought, or the drought prior to what we had last year. The graphic here in the lower left is what we have, what we're seeing here in May of 2018. So at this time, 2018, we did have some portions of the basin that were in drought or starting to intensify in drought, particularly in the central part of the basin. We had, some, and we'll get into the departure from rainfall average in the next couple of slides, but we had some areas that had not seen rain for quite a while. The drought intensified, going into the late August time period, and we were down to about 80% for our system total in 2018, August of 2018. At this point, in May of 2018, we were about 90 to 93%. And then the upper left graphic also shows what we were in late May of 2017. So we did have some drought, and obviously everybody knows what happened in late August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey. But really, once Hurricane Harvey made landfall and dumped all that rain, we started this drought that happened last year. We had some rainfall deficits going forward after Hurricane Harvey. So this is a departure from normal rainfall maps with two periods. One on the left here shows the period from October 1st, 2017 through June 25th of 2018. And you'll see the legend here. It's kind of hard to see here, but the yellows and reds mean the rainfall below normal. So over that period, that's about a 9-month period, I think. So the reds and the yellows are bad, meaning dry, below normal rainfall. And you can see in the central part of the basin, not necessarily in the lower part, but in the central basin, we had very, very dry conditions. Some of the areas in Bell and McLennan and over Limestone County down to Bryan College Station had departure from normals of up to 18 to 16 inches below normal for that period. So when you have areas upstream that are dry, you're not going to have the stream flow, and the river levels dropped, and we did have to make water supply releases last summer for the first time in probably since 2015. So it was one of a drought period that luckily wasn't that long or prolonged, but it was significant. And then after the August to September period, we started to transition to wet, and we're all from Texas. We all know what the climate in Texas can do, and it did flip a switch. So this graphic here, October 1st, 2018 through May 28th of 2019, and you can see large portions of the basin Even around here in the Brenham area, we had some totals of departure from normal up to 20 inches above normal for that period. We'll talk a little bit more about how that translates to river levels, but here in the next couple slides, and water storage. But it's significant because you can go from this to this in a pretty short period of time. We looked at the river flow volumes at the Brazos River at Hempstead Gauge, at USGS Gauge at Hempstead, which is about 200 river miles upstream of the Gulf of Mexico. And the USGS compiles this data on a 15-minute period, but you can actually quantify how much water flows past the gauge over a couple months. And so we looked at each June through August flow volume for each year from 1939 through 2018 at the Hempstead gauge. And you can see some spikes here that are obviously wet years, and you can see some low years. And what's significant about this chart is in 2018, we had one of the lowest flow volumes that passed the Hempstead gauge for June through August. So keep that in mind. That on average, we have about a little over 1.1 million acre feet that flows past that gauge every June through August, and we were about an eighth of that total last year. So that's significant. This right here causes this, and we did have some water supply releases that were included in that. This number was about 140,000 acre feet. So going forward, we also looked at the Richmond gauge, which is about 100 river miles downstream of the Hempstead gauge and about 100 river miles upstream of the Gulf, and looked at a similar graphic here, and looked at the October to December flow volume at the Brazos River at Richmond. And so the period of record at Richmond is a really long period of record. It goes back to 1903. We do have a data gap here in the early part of the 1900s that the gauge wasn't working. But what's significant about this is we had the highest flow volume for the October to December at the Richmond gauge in 115 years. So you can go from just the June through August period that was just a couple months before that to the October to December period and get about 5.5 million acre feet. So this is about 3 times what the average, or 4 times what the average is over this period. And so 5.5 million acre feet of water, you could fill up every reservoir in our system from empty to full about 3 times with that 5.5 million acre feet. Or said another way, you could supply all the customers in the VRA Basin for about over 18 years with that amount of water. So it's real significant that you can have those 2 periods in a short amount of time over the course of about 6 months. So how's everything now? Well, most everybody knows that all the reservoirs are full or over full. This is our percent full graphic that we update every Wednesday. We post it on our website. This is kind of looking across the basin, kind of if you're like in San Angelo, looking across to Texarkana. So at the far left, you have Possum Kingdom up here in the upstream part of the basin, Granbury, Whitney, and then all the core reservoirs, limestone over here. Everything is full, and you can see in the tabulated upper right-hand corner, the percent full of a lot of the core reservoirs are into the flood pool. I know a couple weeks ago, looking at the flood control storage, we had about 1.4 million acre feet of flood control storage that was being stored in the core reservoirs. And the Corps is making slow releases from those reservoirs over they have been over the last couple months, and they will continue. At PK and Granbury, we're in continual flood operations right now. At Possum Kingdom, we may have to go to a 3rd gate as far as release, and that's significant. There's the water in the river is full all the way up to past Seymour, and that's over 900 river miles of the river. So we're going to have water for a while now. And the other thing I wanted to mention is since January 1st of this year, Possum Kingdom, Granbury, and Limestone have released about 2.6 million acre feet of floodwater. So that's, you know, we basically could empty all of the reservoirs from empty to full and then fill it back up with that 2.6 million acre feet, have about 500,000 or 600,000 acre feet left over. So a lot of water everywhere. So what does the outlook look like? Well, this is the NOAA outlook that they release on a monthly period, primarily the first part of, or the middle part of each month. And you can see the legend here. This is kind of a little bit hard to read, but most of the lower 48 is drought free or is improving. I think I've heard in the last month or so that since the drought monitor has been, I guess, tabulated or tracking over the last 20 years, that this has been the least amount of area of the lower 48 that has been impacted with drought. So we're at a record low if you look at it on a 20-year basis since the drought monitor has been taking readings. So that's significant. Going forward, you know, we don't see any drought, obviously, with all the water everywhere. In the next, this goes through the end of August. Changing gears now, we wanted to talk to you a little bit about the system operations permit and long-term contracting. We did go to our board in late April to present to them the allocation of the system operation permit, and which is about 100,000 acre feet of new contracts. We are coordinating with those customers that are on those lists that will be entering into new contracts here soon. We will be going to our board in July and updating our contract forms, so that's something that we're working on right now. And then going forward, we're hoping to begin executing those new long-term contracts under SysOps in August of 2019 and get those ready for FY 2020. One last slide from the water supply perspective. We had our annual water use reservoir accounting, sheets in the back. I think all of y'all have this. You don't need to read this or anything, but we wanted to make sure that y'all knew that it was available. We update this and we present it on our website, usually at the end of March, towards the first part of April, after we get all the accounting straight. And that's something that it's a great tool. There's a lot of information there related to customer water use, all the way to the specifics on reservoir accounting, the inflows, evaporation, et cetera, over all the 11 reservoirs in the system. I think that was it. Does anybody have any questions?
Go back to your slide, the two slide.
The two, okay.
Yeah, right there. I want to point out something. So the technologies at our reservoirs are different. And at Possum Kingdom, we own Possum Kingdom and we own Granbury. At Possum Kingdom, it's almost 100 years old. So when we open a gate, it's 9,000 CFS at a time. At Granbury, we have how many gates? 16 that we can raise in inch increments. So we have, the way you operate a reservoir is you have all these meters upstream of your reservoir, and as water's flowing towards you, you're calculating how much is coming towards you versus how much you're releasing. And then these guys are working with River Forecast Center, Army Corps of Engineers, to make sure that they're controlling to the extent possible downstream flooding. So what you're seeing, we're talking about all these reservoirs being full, but if you were a keen of eye, you look and you say, well, no, Possum Kingdom and Granbury aren't full. Our biggest challenge is when a thunderstorm pops up right over the top of the lake and starts dumping water on us, water bomb, right over the top of the lake. It's very hard to manage. So when we know we have a lot of water coming to the reservoir and we're fearful of a water bomb, we will actually release a little bit more water and draw these reservoirs down just a little bit more to give us a little bit more reaction time. In our reservoirs, we have no flood storage. So what comes in has to come out. So we lower them just a little bit. We don't consider it pre-release. as Matt will talk to you about with some of the pre-release style legislation, where there were talk that reservoir owners would, during hurricane season, go ahead and draw their reservoirs down, let's say 2 or 3 feet to protect from a hurricane. That's not what we're doing. We know we have water in the river coming our way, so we let a little bit of water out to protect us from that water coming and from a rain bomb. And then when all the rain is done, as the water's coming in, our hydrologists land the plane right up to a perfectly conservation full reservoir. So that's why, if you'll notice, that's why the reservoirs in Granbury and Possum Kingdom are a little bit less than normal right now. So any questions for Aaron? Yeah, please.
Possum Kingdom and Granbury the only place y'all contract water from?
Yeah, so we have, BRA owns and operates 3 reservoirs, Possum Kingdom, Granbury, and Lake Limestone. We also have storage contracts with the Corps of Engineers at 8 other core reservoirs. So we contract lakeside all the way downstream from all 11 of these reservoirs all the way down to Freeport. And depending on where you're located, we can release water from, if you're on the river, depending on how many reservoirs are upstream, we have the flexibility of releasing stored water downstream to your point, with several different reservoirs depending on your location.
Matt?
Good morning. Can y'all hear me? I'm one of those mic people that has a problem with the mic. I don't talk very loud. It's usually because nobody's listening. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened during the session. I'll stick mainly to water-related issues. I'm not going to get into a bunch of the weighty issues that the legislature dealt with, like property tax reform and public school finance. You guys can read about those. The only thing I will say is the fact that they're not being called back is a success for those of us that spent the last 140 days down there. I'm glad to see them go home for a little while, hopefully for a full year and a half. Before I get into this, I will say that I'm going to touch on a handful of bills. I have a much more detailed report that I can email you if you give me your card. It's got longer analyses of each bill than I'm going to get into today, and a much longer list of bills. The other thing I'll say is we are still in the period where the governor can veto bills. So some of the bills I'll talk about, if they haven't been signed already, the governor still could veto any one of them all the way up until June 16th. I think there's very little chance of that, but just keep that in mind as I go through these. We knew flooding would be a big issue this session, especially coming out of Hurricane Harvey. It seemed like at some point during the session, every member of the legislature had a flood-related bill. So we knew it was something that they would spend a lot of time on. They spent a lot of time in the interim studying flooding issues and how to better prepare the state for flooding. They ended up passing a handful of different bills, and I'll go through each of those. House Bill 26 is a dam release notification bill. It basically requires a dam operator to notify downstream emergency operations centers in the counties downstream of a dam when they're making a release, and give them information such as the duration of the release and the size of the release. For us, this is nothing new. We already do this. We already work very closely with and notify all of the EOCs downstream of our dams whenever we're making a release, but it wasn't a statewide requirement and it wasn't common practice. So House Bill 26 sets up a process where TCEQ is going to oversee the creation of plans for each dam operator, where they're going to say, here's how we're going to notify everybody when we make a release. So a pretty simple thing, but something that not everyone was doing at the time. Senate Bill 6 is very much a training-related bill. It requires the Texas Division of Emergency Management to create training programs for local jurisdictions on how to better train for and prepare for and respond to disasters. So that's really a TDEM bill to provide training to local cities, counties, other entities in order to make sure that we're better prepared in the event of a Hurricane Harvey-like event. The other important part of Senate Bill 6 is it requires the creation of a group to study wet debris removal. So think of that as all of the debris that builds up in the river or the streams or the tributaries during a flooding event or a disaster event. How do you deal with that? Whose job is it to remove it? And most importantly, who pays for it and how do you pay for it? You can imagine in a river basin the size that we have, it's roughly the size of Tennessee, we could have log jams and river debris in any area, any number of areas in our basin. And who is going to pay for removing that, and how do you maintain that over time? I think that there were some folks that went into the legislative session with the idea of assigning that responsibility to someone. We looked a lot like that someone at some points during the session. When we kind of educated them on the fact that if you assign that duty to us, we'll basically have to create an entire additional line of business and hire additional staff, and it will cost millions upon millions of dollars for us to continually remove debris and continually maintain debris removal throughout our entire basin. They kind of backed off that position and decided to do a study. But watching what comes out of that study will be interesting, because that's not a trivial thing. If they end up attempting to assign that to somebody, a local entity, there's going to be a cost that comes along with that. And if that cost isn't funded by the state, somebody's going to have to pay for it. And then the last three are probably the most high-profile flood-related bills that passed this session. And if you put them all together, they do a couple of things. Senate Bill 7 and HJR 4 create the state's version of a funding mechanism for flood-related projects in the future. So think of this as anything related to funding. So not only will they help provide money to recover from Hurricane Harvey, but they will also provide money for future flood mitigation projects, updating of floodplain maps, all that kind of stuff. Federal match dollars, so to provide money to match federal projects. These in total appropriate approximately $1.7 billion to flooding projects in the future. What they will eventually do is they will fund projects that come out of Senate Bill 8. Senate Bill 8 creates a statewide flood planning process. We're all pretty familiar, at least some of you may be familiar with the statewide regional water planning process, where the state's divided into regions. Those regions come up with projects, and those projects can be funded by the state or receive state funding in order to be implemented. This will be the same thing, but it'll be for flood projects. It is likely that those planning groups will coordinate with the regional water planning groups in some way, but how, we don't know. But one of the things that is important in the Senate Bill 8 process is the prioritization process for projects lists projects that have a added water supply benefit in addition to a flood control benefit. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at. Think of the next steps for these bills as a whole bunch of work for the Water Development Board. The Water Development Board was given a large chunk of money and a large chunk of responsibility for funding future flood control projects, but also implementing the state flood planning process. And talking to them candidly in the last couple of weeks, they're up past their eyeballs. They're very overwhelmed with how they're going to adopt rules and create application processes for how all of this is going to work. So that's going to be something that you're just going to kind of have to watch and see how the Water Development Board comes up with all of this stuff. They're going to have to staff up a ton. They were given quite a bit of money to hire new staff. I don't know the exact number, but it's going to be a lot. So they got a lot of work ahead of them. It'll be interesting to watch how they handle it all. Surface water, really slow session, which was fine for all of us. House Bill 723 is one that they've been trying to pass for a while to require TCEQ to update water availability models for all the different basins. Those are the models that they use to issue water right permits. In all cases, the models for every basin are outdated. They haven't been updated to reflect the most recent drought. So House Bill 723 requires that those be updated. The Brazos is included as one of those. And then House Bill 1964 is meant to streamline the water right permit amendment process for minor permit amendments. So think of this as if you have a diversion point on a piece of property and want to move that diversion point to another spot on that same piece of property, and doing so won't affect a water right in between there, meaning there's not a diverter in between there, that you could have kind of an expedited, sped up permitting process. You won't have to go through all of the red tape. So it's just meant to get those out of the way so TCEQ can focus more on major water right permits and address the backlog of those that they have. Groundwater was a little bit more active. House Bill 720, 721, and 722, think of those as addressing the permitting processes, and one of them is actually a study, but these two addressing the permitting processes for aquifer storage and recovery and brackish groundwater, and doing so in such a way that kind of promotes the use of those technologies, so that makes the permitting process easier, more efficient, more predictable, so that those types of projects become more attractive. There's a desire in the legislature to see more ASR projects, to see more brackish desal. A lot of folks have said over time that either the permitting process is uncertain, unknown, or one doesn't exist. Every groundwater district might do it differently. And so these bills are an attempt to try to address that problem by creating a much more uniform and understandable permitting processes for those types of projects. And then House Bill 1066 requires groundwater districts to issue export or transfer permits for the same length of time that they issue production permits. Right now, a groundwater district can give you a production permit for 10 years and a transfer permit for 2 years. And obviously that's not ideal if you're an exporter of groundwater where you move it from one area to another. And so it requires those permit timelines to be linked up. So if you have a 10-year production permit, you have to be given a 10-year transfer permit. And then, nobody cares about this. Just kidding. Last but not least, the Allens Creek bill, and a lot of you in the room are very familiar with this. So we've talked to you guys for many years about our efforts to move the Allens Creek Reservoir project forward. As you all know, it'll be a very beneficial project to the basin. It'll provide an additional 100,000 acre-feet of water to the lower Brazos Basin. It'll be an off-channel reservoir that will catch high flows and move them into the reservoir when we're either releasing water or flows are high in the river. It'll allow us to conserve water upstream because it'll be the first reservoir we use to meet downstream needs. Overall, it's a project that's very much needed for our basin that we've been working on for several years. The problem with it is our project partner in the Allens Creek Reservoir, the city of Houston, who happens to be the majority project partner, meaning they're the 70% owner or the 30% owner, does not have a need for the project. They cannot demonstrate a need. There's no relevant planning document that shows them ever needing water from the Allens Creek Reservoir. Whereas we have a drastic need for the project. We needed it 5 years ago and have needed it for many, many years. And all relevant planning documents, the Region H plan, the state water plan, show all of that water staying in and going to users in the Brazos Basin. So for probably the last 10 years, we have tried to work with the city of Houston to get them to allow us to move forward. And more recently, over the last 2 or 3 years, as we've informed you whenever we've had these meetings, we've tried to entice Houston into letting us buy them out. So let us buy out your interest, let us become the owner of the project. We could even potentially reserve an amount of water for Houston, just something. Those negotiations hit a pretty hard impasse right before the legislative session. So what happened from there is several of the potential eventual users of that water in our lower basin, to include Gulf Coast Water Authority, Dow Chemical, and there were some others, decided to help push a bill that would require Houston to accept a buyout. That bill was House Bill 2846. It passed the House 143-5. It passed the Senate 26-5, and was signed by the governor this past weekend. So it obtained a lot of support in the legislature. What it does is it requires Houston to enter into a contract with the Brazos River Authority by January 1 of 2020 that will transfer all of their interest in the Allens Creek Reservoir project to the Brazos River Authority. In exchange for that, we will pay the city of Houston what they themselves have said they have invested in the project, and that's $23 million. Roughly half of that is debt payments that they've already paid to the Water Development Board. So that will provide the Brazos River Authority with 100% ownership of that project. It'll allow us to begin the 404 permitting process, which we haven't been able to do, even though we have a firm already sitting waiting to start that process. To set expectations, because I think that's important, the city of Houston opposed the bill throughout the entire process. There's a very good chance they're not going to be very cooperative in our attempts to implement that legislation. As David said, we tomorrow or Monday at the latest are planning to send them a letter with a draft contract that says, in accordance with House Bill 2846, here's a draft contract that will effectuate the provisions of that bill. Let's go ahead and get that started and tell us where to send you the $23 million. I don't know what their response is going to be. Could be litigation, we'll see. The only other expectation setting that I would give is that getting 100% control of this project is obviously beneficial for us, it's beneficial for our basin. It will be a major step in allowing the project to move forward, but we still have to go through all of the steps in moving that project forward, and one of those is getting a 404 permit from the Corps of Engineers. So we'll have to start that process. We don't know how long that's going to take. We anticipate anywhere from 3 to 5 years, but who knows? So once we get ownership of the project and we're able to start the permitting process, that timeline starts, and we'll be in the middle of that for a little while, I would imagine. So it's a good thing. We thank our supporters who helped us get there. We could not have gotten there without y'all. If we'd have tried it by ourselves, we would have surely lost. So We pulled it off, and we'll just kind of see where it goes from here. Be happy to answer any questions.
So when I start talking Allen's Creek, our staff always gets kind of wishy-washy because they know I'm going to overcommit. And we do have shovels in the back of my truck for those of you that want one. So, but let me tell you where we are. Our board, because, and you've heard me say this before, we're close. We thought we were close, and then as Matt said, November before the legislative session, we hit a brick wall. And that's the reason we went the path that we did. We were close enough that we went ahead and hired, or interviewed, and approved a consultant, Stantec Engineering. They're pretty well known in the reservoir business, as they're really the only ones in the United States that are building multiple reservoirs at a time. They have teamed with, say it again, SWCA out of Houston for environmental work and a whole host of other folks. So they are at the starting line ready. A year and a half ago, our board of directors approved $86 million for us to sign contracts and begin doing the 404 permitting. Alongside the 404 permitting, we're going to do up to 30% design. That benefits us in a couple of ways. It gets us down the road on the project. It also allows us in our 404 application to the Corps to give them more engineering, so they'll be able to hopefully make a decision quicker on what it is we're proposing to do. So the whole $86 million is not for permitting. It's for permitting, it's for total design of the reservoir, and it's also for construction management all the way through construction of the project. So realistically, if we could have a reservoir on the ground in 10 to 15 years, I think that would be a really significant win for us, and that's what we're aiming for. So we're going to move out and see what Houston does and begin to spend money and permit and design and move on down the road. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Well done. Yes, sir.
What steps could the city of Houston take to try to avoid that?
Dave, that's what we're trying to figure out. I think their first step, if they wanted to throw a roadblock at us, would be to file an injunction with court that would not allow BRA to step into the intent of the legislature. So we've done a lot of homework, and we think there's a lot of court cases in the past that show legislative involvement with non-private entities, and we think it favors us. We think the fact that this project was resumed from the dead back in the late 90s by the legislature. It was again delayed by the legislature. The water permit was created through the legislature, through the TCEQ. We think there's fingerprints all over this to justify why the legislature's involved in it now. So we think we have a really good story to tell as far as if they challenge us. So philosophically, just let me share this with you. If Houston came to the table before the legislative session and said, okay, we're ready to build 70-30, we own 70, BRA, you own 30. In the contract that was signed back in the 90s, BRA had the obligation to build it, even if they were the 70% partner. I think with a partner that's not necessarily wanting to build a $500 million project, I think it would take us 1.5 to 2 years to work out all of the tangled project issues that we would have to get through to spend that money. So in my opinion, even if we do get tied up in court for 1 to 2 years and we prevail and we have 100% ownership of the reservoir, I think it is still a huge benefit to the Brazos Basin and the lower basin customers that water is solely owned by the BRA. In the testimony in the Senate, you can go back and listen to it, Houston made it very clear. That water's in the state water plan for use in the Brazos Basin. That was part of Houston's testimony. So the problem that presents, and many of you have heard me say this, you're going to have a holding tank with water in it, and you're going to have a majority owner at 70% that's going to value that water one way, and a BRA that's going to value that water another way. So there'll be a race to the moon to buy BRA's water, and then a negotiation to figure out how you buy the rest of it. And so, you know, in my opinion, you end up with two very different costs of water, and a municipality that wants to use that water for a revenue source. Well, that's not the intent of the water. It's owned by the state. It should be to the benefit of the state.
The only thing I would add to that, we're going to get into Houston's position during the session. What's even more scary is that as the session evolved, they decided that, okay, maybe we do need water. Maybe we will use it. Not right now, but 2040, we might want it. So what we'll do is we'll help you build it, and maybe we'll sell it to you for a little while, and then eventually we'll reserve it for ourselves and we'll use it ourselves. So it would become then an interrupted supply for those who are relying on it for a long-term supply, because they'd sell it to you for 10 or 15 years and then eventually say, okay, you can have it when we're not using it, but then now we do need it. So
Does that work for you, Ivan?
yeah, I think that works for everybody.
I thought that's why you're sitting next to me. So anyway, we're excited about where we are. We think we came out with a win, and we're going to aggressively move forward. That answer your question, Dave?
Yes, sir.
A little bit? Thanks. Okay, thank y'all. Tiffany?
Hi, David asked me just to give everyone kind of a brief overview of the variety of activities we do at BRA, and why this would be beneficial for you to know is if you ever need data to support projects, odds are really strong that we already have a good historical data set. Since it's all publicly available data, all you need to do is give a call and ask for it. In our environmental stewardship efforts, our first and foremost, our job is water quality monitoring, and that is a job that is mandated to us by the state of Texas, and we work in conjunction with TCEQ to collect that data and get it submitted. And that data is used to assess compliance with surface water quality standards. It's also used in TPDS permitting processes as far as identifying the quality of the existing streams. And we use that data to identify areas where we think we have concerns or issues with water quality and impairments where it's not meeting the standards. On any given year, we monitor anywhere between 120 and 175 sites across the basin. So we have quite a bit of data. Odds are good we're somewhere close to you. Our next primary task that we work a lot on, and I think this is very important, is working with TCEQ on standards validation. Back when standards were set in the late 80s, early 90s, it was kind of a rush to do the state, and they didn't have the benefit of the detailed water data that we have now. So they used applied and presumed standards as the term, and they just kind of blanketed the state. And as we've gone forward, we've realized that that method has not served us well, and that it creates a lot of false impairments. So going back and partnering with TCEQ to do the studies where they can set a site-specific standard appropriate to the conditions of that individual stream has been beneficial. We have got a lot of standards changed over the years, and that has eliminated a lot of impairments that you say, who cares if it's sitting on an impairment list, but EPA has a defined time frame at which they expect TCEQ to address impairments, and those methods to address can sometimes be rather aggressive. So it does save the state quite a bit of money if we get the right standard and the right assessments on things, and then we can spend those limited resource dollars focusing on real world actual problems in other areas. We are working with Parks and Wildlife on a reservoir fisheries habitat improvement program. This is a result of negotiations during our system operations permit and our water management plan. Concerns were, of course, as those negotiations were going on, we were in the middle of a prolonged drought where we were seeing near record low reservoir levels in many parts of the basin, and it became apparent when those water levels got down that the habitat that is available on reservoirs to support a fishery, when the water level is 9-10 feet down, is not there. The aquatic vegetation is stranded up, it dries up, that there's not a lot of structure and debris like you get right along the edge of the reservoir. So how do we make those fisheries resilient when they can survive another drought? We were getting long enough into that drought that it started to be concerns that we were missing enough reproductive seasons due to lack of habitat that we were going to start seeing those reservoir fisheries collapse. So we're working with Parks and Wildlife. They're pretty much guiding us based on each reservoir specific fishery on what structures and where to place them in the reservoir. So in deeper water, if we ever have that again, there is structure down there, things they can use for cover, nurseries, and everything else. So hopefully that those fisheries will be able to self-sustain themselves through another prolonged severe drought. Threatened and endangered species monitoring. This is something that's relatively new to us in the means of we've really started to follow and track in the last 10 years. The increased interest of the federal government in the state of Texas in regards to species. So those of you who've come for the last couple of years have had to hear me drone on about freshwater mussels and the threat that they are to water supply. And the reason we are so concerned about the Federal Endangered Species Act is it is a very powerful piece of legislation and has disrupted state water rights systems in other states. So we take these very seriously. We are starting to embark on a Brazos water snake study. The issue with a lot of these species is they're usually very poorly researched, so we don't really understand much about them, and very little consideration goes into those listings. So trying to gather enough science now to know how to respond if they come up. The snake has been on the state threatened list for quite some time, which means eventually Fish and Wildlife Service will probably look at it and go, why haven't you dealt with a snake? You've had it on your list, but state of Texas, you haven't done much about it. So we're trying to gather that data now, either to fight off the listing and say they're not endangered, it's just that nobody's ever really looked at them before, or if our data comes back and says there might be something there, we can start doing conservation efforts in advance to again make it more difficult for the federal government to come in and disrupt the water supply of the Brazos Basin. The exact opposite, and I spend probably 90% of my time explaining the difference between a zebra mussel and a freshwater mussel that's considered endangered. What we've also had the progressive invasion of the state of zebra mussels, and that can cause some significant infrastructure problems and some impacts to our native biota out in the streams and reservoirs. So we are monitoring, doing pre-detection monitoring on reservoirs not known to have zebra mussels at this time. We also monitor and report invasive plants because they can be almost as destructive to a water system. San Jacinto River Authority and the Sabine River Authority spend millions of dollars a year trying to control invasive aquatics. So if we can keep an eye out, identify them early, and stop the infestation from getting hold in our reservoirs, that's definitely to our benefit. Also, when we do identify some of those true problem streams or that have water quality impairments that threaten either health and safety, the environment, or their usability for water supply, we will go in and work with appropriate regulatory agencies and develop a series of studies to try to identify the source of impairment and solutions to solve it. Often in this case, we will work with the plans and work with the local governments. We usually don't have the authority to compel the change, but if we can get cooperating cities and the state agencies that do, we can see some pretty dramatic improvements. Leon River WPP, they've already reduced half of their impairments through some pretty aggressive actions in that area. The partner counties that joined in on that, they've instituted numerous programs at the county level to help address feral hogs, everything to septic tanks to agricultural practices in their watershed. So these can be really beneficial projects. We support local law enforcement and our lake rangers when they have environmental crimes cases. Quite often we've done sampling for them, helped investigate the source of fish kills, and a variety of other things. It's not something we do a lot, but we do back them up quite frequently. And of course, all VRA facilities, we are subject to the same rules and regulations from the state and federal government that most of you are. So we support all our properties when they need environmental permits to do the things that they need to do moving forward in their different construction and maintenance activities. And overall, I often get asked what is our most, what are the things we're concerned about going forward? And there's a variety of them at different levels of, one, balancing competing interests. We know the population is growing dramatically, and we know our water supply right now is not adequate to supply that growth, projected population growth. Water supply and water quality and the environment can often be at odds with each other. So how do we balance that out where we're supplying the water we need without doing harm to the environment? That's a big one, and that is a tough one. Nutrient regulations will probably be coming down the path. We've already got some nutrient standards established on some of our reservoirs. TCQ and EPA are still hashing out the remaining reservoirs in the state, and once that's over, they'll start looking at estuaries and streams and rivers. That has in some areas, I would say it is critically necessary to protect the streams, others not so much, depending on their natural conditions. But it definitely has the potential to greatly impact TPS dischargers. Y'all will be the low-hanging fruit that when a stream is not compliant with its standard, that will be the first place to go, because y'all are easy to regulate. It's much harder to regulate agricultural communities and wildlife and other non-pollutant sources. Climate variability is something that we battle with it, and I'm not even talking long-term climate change, it's the drought flood cycle. We had a wonderful schedule planned out in February for this spring, and we've got one of our biological sampling events accomplished because Aaron has put everything underwater for us. Destruction of riparian vegetation, that is causing numerous problems, especially in the lower part of the basin where historically lands were clear cut to the edge of the river. It's causing a lot of erosion problems that are exacerbated by these high flow events, and then where that sediment gets deposited and where it goes is an issue, and it also creates water quality issues. It muddies up the water. The removal of the tree cover can raise the temperatures in the water because it's not getting shaded. So that's something that I think eventually will have to be addressed somewhere. I know U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has already tried to hint at it a few times, and we said it's private property, but eventually I think we might have to listen to those. And then the big one is just the recent trends of rush science and regulations and consensus and advocate-based decisions over the actual reliance of pure hard science to make decisions. And that it goes back to the same thing with the standards. A bad regulation isn't going to be protective of the environment, nor is it going to be beneficial to communities, because y'all are going to spend a lot of time and effort and resources chasing something that's never going to meet the goal because it wasn't set right to begin with. So those are the things that worry me at night. Any questions? Mr. Thompson will give you the financial overview.
So I hope this, yeah, okay, it works good. So I'm going to deviate a little bit from my standard presentation and actually look at our business model that we use for calculating the system rate. And I'm going to go line by line through it, and then later I'll show you the FY 2020 budget that we have proposed. I know it's smaller numbers, but the first line is our operating expense, and we had an increase of $3 million, and that's due primarily to the Corps of Engineers increase in budget between 19 and 20. And this is the money that we use to help pay for the maintenance on the 8 core lakes that we have. The next 2 lines are basically our debt service payments. The first is one called subject to coverage, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But that is the East Williamson County intake at Lake Granger, as well as the water treatment plant that we purchased in Taylor. The next line is the debt service coverage not subject to coverage, and these are basically our loans. Corps of Engineers, we have loans with them that for the water storage that we have in the 8 core lakes. We also have state participation loans with Texas Water Development Board for Allen's Creek. In 19, it was 30%. Now it's 70% added to that number of 1.5 million in 2020 budget. Also, we have our operating project expenditures. And these are projects that are studies, assessments. They can be IT software, anything, or repairs, anything that doesn't build to our major capital infrastructures. And they're included in our rates too, giving you about $56 million in expense for that. Next is the non-system rate revenues that we have. We have the first one, which is the non-system water revenues coming from our 2-tier as well as our utility long-term contracts. And the other water revenues that we have are basically like lake permits, interest from our investments. It can include the wastewater and water treatment facilities we own. And that gives you about $19 million in revenue. And then the last piece is the debt coverage. In the line we talked about East Williamson County bonds, our board has set a 1.3% ratio for the debt coverage. In that you take 30% times the 2.5, and that's the $760,000 that we're required to have. So now you just take the 56 less the 19, add back the 760, and you basically come up with the gross financial requirements. Now then, we have basically how many acre feet that we used in the calculation. In 19, we had 372,000 acre feet, and now we're at 468,000 feet with the SysOps permits added to that. You divide it into the gross amount, and right now it's at $82 for 19 and $82 for 2020. If you remember back in 19, we went from 18 to 19, $74 up to $76.50, but it should have actually gone to $82. So we use another tool that we have in our rate making that our board approved, which is basically the rate stabilization reserve. We use that to pull the rates back down until the rates can catch back up later on in later years. Again, with adding the 1.5 million that we got from the 70% of Allen's Creek, we actually ended up needing to be at 82. Now, we just mailed out letters a few weeks ago saying it's going to be 79. We also forecasted last year being 79. So again, we're going to use the rate stabilization reserve to bring it back down to $79. So now here's the proposed revenues. And again, you can see the 37 million is coming from our system rate. Here's the non-system rate, and here's the 11.6 that I talked about from other programs, and then basically our rate stabilization. And then the cost reimbursable is another piece that we have in revenue. Now this is where BRA maintains facilities for our customers, such as Tipple, Belton, Dozier Farm. These are waste treatment plants, in which the cost, every dollar cost that we incur from those facilities, we bill them back for that. And you can see in here, here's the 12.8 to cover that. Here's also the other expenses that we just talked about, the water supply, operating expenses, the projects that we have, and basically that service cost for $69 million. So here's a long list of our operating projects for 2020. We've got a lot of programs we've got going on for next year, some involved with Tiffany and her programs, but also other studies and assessments we need to get done. There are some funds that we do get from other stakeholders, as well as grants to cover a couple of the programs we have out there. And this just lets you know about the Corps of Engineers. Their budget for 2020 was $8.2 million, and it's about $18 an acre foot that's in the $79. Now, just looking at the capital projects for 2020, it's 46.7. 32 million of that is basically the new water supply. And if you look at the details of it, you can see that 30 million of it is going to come from Allen's Creek. And as Matt mentioned before, 23 of that 30 is to pay the city of Houston. And then the other one is to get started with our program in 2020. The other project costs out there, or capital project costs, are to maintain our 3 lakes that we own in the basin. We also have Lake Belton still has Howell pipeline that we're going to start up in that 2020 period too. The capital projects do not impact directly the rate, indirectly through the debt service payments and interest as you get into the outer years. Just want to make that comment. So here's the total water that we have to sell, 719,000 acre feet. 65%, or the 468,000 acre feet, is coming from our system rate holders. Here's kind of the breakdown of how these numbers work out. You can see 2-tier as well as utilities make up the next largest portion after you get the system rate units that are out there. And this just gives you a perspective of how you can convert the acre feet to 1,000 gallons. You can see between the 2 years, it's less than a penny increase per 1,000 gallons. That's what we're asking for the increase for. So now taking a long-term look, we went out probably about 9 years. You can see the debt structure starting to pick up as we've now absorbed the 70% of Allen's Creek into this and the build out. You also have replacements of Tainer gates in here, still has a hollow pipeline being built. So the rates, we're looking at about $125 per acre foot out in the outer years. We do need to do some more fine tuning. I mean, we just recently, with Allen's Creek, so we'll need to probably take a little look to see out here what the impact of that is. So these may adjust further out here because there's some pretty big jumps out there. So this kind of gives you an idea of what the rate stabilization reserve is doing. And you can see we are using it here. And then at the point that we bring the rates back in line here, it's actually putting money back into the rate stabilization reserve, which builds up and helps self-fund and keeps us from borrowing money. We do need to do some work out here to see what impact some of these programs have. We don't have the final interest rates that we're going to have for the borrowing for the 500 million. So there's some more fine tuning we need to do in the outer years to see if those numbers are correct right now. But I just wanted to put something together so that you can see kind of some ideas of where the rates are going to be going up and because of Allen's Creek. I just want to let people know again, I have this every year on the uninterrupted water, and just a reminder that priorities of less than 1,000 feet are given. The deadline is August 30th, that's a Friday. And then we do have established firm deadlines for payments and executing contracts. And as usual, the interrupted water is not approved until the October board meeting.
David, go back to your cost estimates going forward. Next, back there you go. Couple things. First of all, to go back to a comment that he made about about $8, was it $17 from the Corps of Engineers?
$18.
So we meet so let me explain that to you. All of the reservoirs that Aaron showed you that aren't VRA owned are owned by the federal government. They own the reservoir. The water within, let's just call it the holding pod, is owned by the state of Texas. So that water's permitted to us. So we actually pay the Corps of Engineers a lease, if you will, to store that water. That lease goes to pay for the O&M of their reservoirs. And over the last 2 or 3 years, they have done an excellent job at our request, coming and sitting down with us 2 or 3 times a year and walking us through their budgets, walking us through their projects, accountability, so we can understand what they're doing. But it's a double-edged sword also. We want to understand where they need money, because the last thing that we want is the federal government underfunding those projects, and those projects reaching an age and an operational stage where they can't be operated appropriately, because that's where the majority of the water that we release for you all is stored behind. So there's accountability there, and the Corps of Engineers is doing an excellent job. Before we ever move out on Allen's Creek, we had our consultant in Waco last Friday just to begin the process of accountability on how we're going to spend money for Allen's Creek. So we're not going to sign the contract and say, okay, go, here's $86 million, go do all this permitting and planning and engineering and design. There are going to be a lot of deliverables and a lot of meetings and processes put in place so that we can track and make the appropriate decisions on how to spend money at every step of the way through permitting, through design, because the last thing we want to do is waste money permitting a reservoir. So there's going to be a very detailed approach into every dime that we spend on Allen's Creek project. You have my word on that, because it's a very significant project. The other thing that we're doing as far as these projections are going, we're about a year into redefining how we project what our long-term expenses are going to be on projects. We're putting together a capital improvement strategy that's got some matrices. One of those is risk, and looking at the timing of our projects, the best way to do our capital projects so that over time, these numbers become more precise, if you will, on what that's going to look like well beyond 2028. We have two challenges that many of you municipalities have, and industries also. We're old and we need new. So we're budgeting on how we're going to get another 100 years out of a reservoir at Possum Kingdom that's almost 100 years old, with a replacement cost that I dare to say is somewhere north of $1 billion. So that's not even on the table. So we've got to do a very aggressive, thorough job on planning and maintaining those very old reservoirs. You may have heard me say our newest reservoir is 40 years old. And then we need Allen's Creek. We need Lake Whitney. We need other water supply projects that we have an integrated water supply study that's part of this budget that will bring experts to the table to help figure out, okay, what's beyond Whitney, what's beyond Allen's Creek. So we've got some of the same challenges that are going to impact how these numbers look. Here's the one thing I can guarantee you. We can't develop new water for $76.50 an acre foot. So you know that. We've had those discussions before, and we will continue to be very wise with the money that we collect on our water rates and make sure that we're transparent and we spend it and we communicate to you how we're doing it and get your input. So there you have it. Any questions for David or what you've seen here as far as the numbers go? Okay. Well, again, if you need us to come sit down and have a one-on-one conversation about this stuff, we never intended for you to look through all of those projects. On Monday, this presentation will be on www.brazos.org. Also on Monday, along with this presentation, we're going to also link the presentation where that we showed our board a few weeks ago on the breakout of the system operations permit. So that'll be on the web also. So if you have any questions about that, let us know. I want to take just a minute, if you'll allow me to, before we go to lunch, and introduce a few people to you. First of all, Molly Moeller's here with TCEQ. She is the water master. And she has been, for the last 2 days, she's been at all of our meetings. And I think that speaks volume for her commitment to getting to know you and working through water issues in the Brazos. So we really appreciate your time and travel and spending as much time with us as you have. Also, you may or you may not know, we are governed by a board of directors that's appointed by the governor, and we have some of our board members here. Mr. Dave Scott is here. Dave, thank you for coming. Sal Zaccanino is here. And one of our newest board members, Wayne Wilson, and his bride, Linda's here. So thank you all for coming very much. Oh, and last but not least, before we get directions on lunch, City of Brenham, thanks for hosting us. Thanks for letting us use this room. We really appreciate our relationship in the water business and you allowing us to use the facilities. So with that, we're ready for lunch. Follow the ladies in the back. Thank y'all very much.